Thank you very much, Dr. Altbeck, for that wonderful talk. At this point, what we're going to do is move it over to the panelists. Each panel will have 5 minutes to comment and share their remarks. Then we will move into the Q&A in the last part of this evening. So perhaps Dean LaBrie could start us off.
I mentioned right to some folks out in the reception area that the surest way to lower an intellectual discussion was to invite a dean to sit on a panel. So thank you for this, and thank you for the other panelists who have joined us from hither and yon. So many of the issues that Dr. Altbeck is actually talking about, I think we face at a university and at a college and sometimes at a program level in very real and tangible ways. I do have to say that, just my own personal experience, having been raised a French-Canadian in a U.S. system where my first language was French, not English, meant that essentially I was in that class of individuals as new immigrants to a country where had massification not happened in the United States, my lot would probably never have had access to education. So I think that the notion of massification certainly has its issues and its problems, and we can certainly think about the degradation of the academy from years past when research universities and well-defined here in the United States, 4-year liberal arts institutions were extremely well-defined. But I have to believe in my optimistic self that the notion of massification across the world for higher education is inherently a good thing. In particular, I think the notion of the education of women, economic development, take women's issues, and there certainly is a moral context to it. But if you think of developing nations, and when you systematically eliminate 50% of your population and don't provide them education or an opportunity for advancement in their own personal lives, you really economically disadvantage your own country. So, my general feeling is this notion of massification, especially where it has an effect on bringing so many new women into the educational systems around the world, albeit some of these educational systems clearly are underdeveloped and need a lot more reinforcing, I think is inherently a good thing. I do agree with Dr. Altbeck. I think that the financial pressures and the shifting of the private good versus the historical reason for education was really a public good, but we've really shifted in many respects where certainly here in the United States, and I hear this in other English-speaking countries, in particular the UK and Australia, and certainly heard it when I was a dean in Canada, that the expectation was that you were personally going to benefit a great deal economically over the course of your life for the credential that you were going to own, so why not pay for it, and why not expect the individual to contribute considerably more to the cost of their education. And so that shift away from this is good for society to this is good for an individual, I think is a huge tension worldwide, not just here in the United States, but I think globally. Because you see some of the most disadvantaged populations, in particular, and Hélène is a much better expert here on Africa than I am, but if you take a look at probably some of the most egregious cases, in particular in Africa, where private education, and private in many respects is also for-profit, they don't have a tradition of a not-for-profit private system. That the for-profit educational, the tuition charging piece that African students have access to inherently is of considerably less quality. So, I take a look at a lot of these issues and I see some good and some bad. Certainly I'm enthusiastic about the issue of massification. I'm particularly excited about when we take a transnational program such as we've done in Ho Chi Minh City with our leadership program, or take our program to Hong Kong, our doctorate in education into Hong Kong and other areas that we've talked about. And the notion of taking a not-for-profit private model and bringing it into a market that's very used to a for-profit private model and challenging those systems and those notions, I think is a good response that Northeastern is doing, that we are doing here in this college, to this notion of exclusively private education being a for-profit piece. Listen, I have 3 pages of notes. This could go on for a long time, but I really am looking forward to hearing what my other panelists say, but thank you for those remarks.
Thank you very much, Dean Labrie. Dr. Bumbly.
Sure. I was inspired by Mary's introduction with some notable quotes, and one that has really stuck with me over the years is a quote that my boss at the Academic Cooperation Association in Belgium would often say. His name was Bernd Wester, and he would say, "A person without data is a person with an opinion." And it strikes me as we think about these major trends and issues and challenges around the world, that one of the major ones that's kind of wrapped up in all of this is this issue of data. The issue of really trying to understand underneath the trends what's going on, what's happening, how, why, and what are the implications. I think this is a very difficult issue to grapple with. I think it's also interesting because I find that we're living in an era with an unbelievable amount of information out there, particularly information relating to higher education. In the very short time that I've had a bit of a scholarly career in higher education, it has been astonishing to see the number of new kinds of publications, ranging from newsletters and newspapers to scholarly journals that are trying to get at issues of higher education and help us all understand what's happening there. On the one hand, that's a fantastic thing. On the other hand, it is troublesome in the way that we have a lot of fragmented information out there. And I would argue that I think we have a lot of researchers talking to one another, practitioners talking to one another, policymakers talking to one another, and a challenge in bringing those different communities together to really understand these different sides of the equation when it comes to higher education. So for me, that's a very crucial issue. On a more personal level, my particular deep connection to the study of higher education has to do with the phenomenon of internationalization. So this idea that Dr. Altbach mentioned of our universities teaching and researching and serving in ways that are distinctly not exclusively local, not monocultural, not monolingual, but rather plural and complex and very dynamic. We face the same challenge in this very niche area of internationalization, of understanding deeply what's going on with this phenomenon. And we find ourselves, I think, focusing in on particular parts of the phenomenon of internationalization much more so than other parts. So I have a colleague in the Netherlands, Jos Pelen, who talks about the 80-20 rule, that we wear 20% of our clothing 80% of the time. And we seem to focus in our talking about internationalization on the very tiny percentage of students, for example, who are internationally mobile, and completely ignore the immobile majority. We have an enormous amount of work to do, I think, in getting at the aspects of internationalization that have not traditionally been part of our attention, having to do with the immobile groups within our ranks, our student ranks, and also faculty mobility, I think, is another area, with faculty playing such a crucial role in the transmission of knowledge and the generation of new research. We don't know nearly as much about what mobility means for them and what mobility means for the institutions that host them. So a great deal to do there as well. I'd also say that we see an increasing number of national and regional policies. So bumping it up from the institutional level, national and regional policies focused on internationalization that really like the number 20. 20% of something by the year 2020 or something in that range. We need to understand what's going on there? What are these policies really doing, if anything? What kinds of results are they yielding? What should they be focusing on? And what happens when they don't yield the results when we've made investments and put a lot of eggs in a particular basket? So I think I'll stop there. There are many other things we can discuss, but a couple of those ideas to chew on.
Thank you very much. We'll turn it over to Sasha Norkin.
So I was really intrigued by your massification and world-class and the tension between both, because it was almost like a perfect description of how edX, which is a nonprofit, massive, open online course from world-class universities, is a good answer to some of those issues, because if you look at the challenges of massification, you talk about a dumbing down of quality. Well, edX offers massive courses to everyone in the world from top-tier universities. And the cost to the university is small in comparison to if they tried to put, 10,000 people in seats, really hard. edX courses go out to hundreds of thousands of people across the world. And actually, the mix of people is 70% outside the US, the fastest growing areas, to your point. I could have won the prize of which countries, China and India. So it's a really interesting answer to the issue both of quality and access. The other thing, it also brings technology into the picture too. So one of the things that you think about, and you mentioned, was professors and research, right? They're kind of disconnected. But when you have online courses and you have a platform that allows for learning testing to go on, so in the edX platform, you could actually run A/B tests. So an A/B test is something that is used in the world of e-commerce. And in online, where you put one group of people here and you put one group of people here, and they go through the course, and this group maybe gets this kind of test and this group gets this kind of test, or you could do it test by test. So the professor can run through the course an A/B test, testing all sorts of things and get outcomes. And it's not really that much more difficult to do, research. So the professor can really improve their course over time and do research that they can publish and that they can learn and share. So those things are built in and are a bit of an answer to the separation between professors and the cost of research. Then you also, tick another bell for me, Saudi Arabia. So edX also works with countries, Saudi Arabia and the Queen Rania Foundation in Jordan, to bring outside education to their country. So we have an open edX platform, which anyone can use across the world. There are about 900 courses across the world. And then we also do custom work with countries like Saudi Arabia. And so we're bringing in courses from other universities around the world into Saudi Arabia on the platform. So to get away from perhaps the insularity or issues in different countries about you only have people with bachelor's degrees, we can bring in from Harvard, MIT, TU Delft, Tsinghua, all sorts of different perspectives into these different countries, and higher quality education and information that is international in scope. So for example, Tsinghua University is teaching a course on Mao Zedong. So how interesting to get the Chinese perspective. It's a course that people in China take. So you really get it from the source, as opposed to coming, not that there's anything wrong with a university here teaching a course on that, but you really get a different perspective there. So free courses offered online, world-class universities. Now, the last piece is something we actually announced today, is these, up until now, MOOCs, you didn't get credit for them, right? You took them, they were something that gave you information, they were valuable. You could use them to better yourself, but they didn't have, value. So today, for the first time, we're now offering our MOOCs, some of our MOOCs for university credit. So you can actually take a MOOC on edX and get college credit. We announced that partnership with Arizona State University today and got tons of coverage because it's the first time ever. So I think you're going to see more things like edX going on that are really a new paradigm that could solve potentially some of the problems that you are bringing up, both from the mass side and from the world-class side.
Thank you very much. And we will turn it over to our final panelist, Hélène
Bernot.
Bernot.
Such a complicated name, I cannot say it right myself, because the last name is Norwegian and I'm not Norwegian, so I would like to thank you very much, Marissa and Northeastern University, for inviting me here this evening to this exceptional event. Thank you, Philip, for your brilliant introduction. And thank you, Dean, for having spoken about Africa. I have the privilege of working, I've worked for the past 8 years regularly with Africa. I work with a foundation in the Netherlands, which is responsible for the internationalization of higher education. Part of our activities is to manage funding from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to strengthen the capacity of higher education in partner countries, some of them, or most of them in Africa. That was a very long sentence. So the punch is, I work in Africa, and the privilege is to work with universities who are confronted with very many of the challenges mentioned by Professor Albach. Access, massification, privatization, excessive internationalization, part-timeification, and the urgency of joining the club of who speaks English for French-speaking and Portuguese-speaking Africa. Now, if you allow me during my, 3.5 minutes left, to zoom into Africa, I would like to ask Professor Albach, should we worry about the future of basic research, even applied research, in and on Africa? Higher education in Africa is not for the African elite. The African elite studies here or in our countries in Europe. They even study in Malaysia. But they don't study in their public universities. And it's very true, public institutions, from what, now I need to be a bit modest here because I've worked in Benin, Ghana, Rwanda, a little bit Uganda and Burundi. But definitely private institutions is for the poorer who buy a few modules to come a little further in their career. Many women there. The public institutions, where still many people receive scholarships from the government, old-fashioned, that's for the rich kids. And the semi-rich, because the very rich, they are in Canada or in the States. I have 3 pages of notes, so I'll have to pick some headlines. What is the role of the diaspora? I would like to have research about what is the potential benefit of this terrible phenomenon of brain drain, but diaspora can bring back a lot to Africa. I heard once a rector from Mali telling me there's nothing worse that can be done to a person than an idle brain. He would rather have his students move outside of Mali than remaining in Mali in bad institutions. And that really struck me. This is getting emotional. But the pain of seeing idle brains which are not triggered, not stimulated sufficiently. Now, OER, Open Educational Resources in Africa, the role, the potential of MOOCs in Africa. It's thrown in the air. But I think that a lot of energy resources should be employed in making sure it lands in the right way. And it's not only landing in the iPad of the student, It's also teaching teachers about how to use online resources, teaching managers of universities about how to turn around their old-fashioned universities into more modern. And now I could zoom into a very exciting universities in Benin, Université d'Abomey-Calavi. But I'll give you a website for an article about this, about how they try on a shoestring to use all kinds of resources, African, international, Swiss, Dutch, to modernize the offer of education by using online in their very limited technical constraints. Women in higher education in Africa, where are they? Out of time. Oh, it's too bad.
I'll finish your thought, please.
Please ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we will open it up to Q&A to the audience. We have an audience that is virtual as well as here on ground, so we'll be taking questions from both the virtual and on-ground folks. Perhaps we could start off our discussion with Hélène's question about Africa as people get ready. And Laura Hannon in the back with the pink shirt will be walking around with a microphone. So if you can just please raise your hand. If you have a question, she will come around with the microphone for you. Also for the panelists, if you could remember to try to repeat the question for the folks that are live streaming. So with that, if we could start the discussion. Yeah.
Can I react actually to some points that Hélène mentioned? Research in Africa, should it be done? Yes, it should be done. However, one has to be cognizant of the fact that African scholars at this point in the development of African universities are not going to win Nobel Prizes in physics. Very unlikely. However, what is important is that one or two universities in every African country, even little ones, needs to be able to play the game with the big boys or girls. And that's what's important about having a research university, in my view, everywhere. No, they're not going to be Harvard, and in fact, or even MIT. And in fact, many research university wannabes around the world have entirely the wrong set of comparable institutions. Well, our committee in Russia has said to some of our 15 universities, which are very good universities already, that you guys should be thinking about Indiana University, you should be thinking about maybe Northeastern, you should be thinking about Minnesota, but forget about Harvard. I'm thinking, I guess we are across the river. Over at Boston College, Harvard could be on the moon for us. We're a very good university, but we don't think about competing with them. It's just not possible. I mean, I could go on. Short answer is yes. They should be doing research, and they should be, even more important, understanding research and communicating about research and participating in international scholarly meetings and this sort of thing. The diaspora is a key element, in my view, in global higher education. Very understudied. We don't understand much about it, yet it's of central importance. The Russians are very good these days in luring back Russians who left Russia after the fall of communism, when the university system there basically imploded. It's since been sort of rebuilt. But they rely very much on Russians living abroad. China does, to some extent, the same thing. So diaspora, very important. The brain drain still exists. people who talk about, brain exchange, yeah, there's some of that. But the point is, when somebody leaves his or her home country, yes, increasingly, they do have links back home, provided by greater ease of communication and so on. But they're still part of a different academic culture, a different research culture, and they're gone. Some go back, very small numbers. Statistics, by the way, tell us, these are from the Survey of Earned Doctorates, so they're very good statistics, that students from India and China who obtained their PhDs in the United States, 80% of them don't go home after finishing their degrees. Now, they may eventually go home. We don't have that data. But after their degrees, they don't return home. They take postdocs, they do startups, they do all kinds of things, but they don't return to their home countries. And by the way, that number is fairly stable over 20 years. So it's not that all of a sudden we're seeing people going home to the motherland or wanting to teach in an Indian university because the Indian economy is growing rapidly. And finally, just a small experience about technology. I give a series of lectures at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Their their bandwidth access is sufficiently problematical that I don't give my lectures directly. They prefer that I record the lectures and be around for Q&A, so that if the technology fails, which it frequently does, they'll still have my humble self to listen to. They don't trust the system. And until we get this bandwidth issue and other technological issues solved in places like Africa, we're not on an equal playing field.
If I could comment on the research university issue in not only Africa, but I think all over in the developing world. And in my mind, it isn't so much the aspirational piece of trying to be having a national university that can compete with, the club, as much as it is to have an indigenous way of training the academic faculty. We forget that in the United States, the production of faculty is actually done by a very small subset of research universities in this country. We're probably looking at, of the 4,000 institutions in the United States of what we would consider higher learning, the production of the faculty for those 4,000 institutions really come out of about 350 institutions in the United States. Now, you translate that particular phenomenon to a country in Africa that has a very large population but no indigenous faculty. They're not able to compete economically to import faculty, and so you have to build that infrastructure just to sustain a rudimentary baseline. And so, even though it is a research function or research university function to produce the faculty, it isn't, for me anyway, the strategy for developing countries to produce baseline research in the same sense that it would be maybe for an MIT or even for a Northeastern or Boston College. It really is the production of a faculty, an indigenous faculty, because frankly speaking, this is a place where they just simply cannot compete. Nobody who is earning Western wages on faculty will go to Africa for a quarter or even a tenth of what they're earning in their home country. And so these countries need to produce their own faculty. And that, to me, is a stronger argument for having research universities in these countries, and why the Western world, in fact, should actually be supporting that function, because it's a crisis.
Okay, we are going to open it up to some questions. Laura.
Is this okay? This question is for Dr. Alba.
Maybe if you guys could identify yourselves.
Oh yeah, Pete Richardson. I'm adjunct faculty with the Global Studies program at CPS at Northeastern. My question, Dr. Alba, is concerning a few months ago, President Obama talked about universal access to two-year colleges, community colleges in the U.S. And I was wondering if you could comment on the potential impact of that on massification and how, if it does pass into becoming a reality, will it ultimately make the U.S. more competitive in the global economy? Thanks.
The question is, would expansion of community colleges make the U.S. more competitive in a global economy? Good question. The short answer, I don't know. Guess, yes, because we would be producing more and hopefully better students who would actually graduate from institutions, and those who wanted to sort of transfer up would have the opportunity to do so, because almost alone in the world, our students can transfer between different kinds of institutions. That is a huge challenge elsewhere. And by the way, the development of community colleges or community college equivalent institutions is a huge problem globally. Very few countries, Germany being a very notable exception here, have this kind of vocational base higher education institution which has relatively open access. The American community college is a remarkable invention, I think. And people look at it in other countries, but somehow haven't gotten their act together to develop them and articulate them. Even in Germany, the Fachhochschulen, the sort of vocational post-secondary institutions, outstanding, great links with industry, very good quality of instruction, and so on. You can't transfer from one of those places to a university. Crazy. Too long an answer. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Nina Estrella. I am a professor here in our Law and Policy program at the College of Professional Studies. And I need to preface this statement so that it's full disclosure. I am a beneficiary of the California Master Plan, without which I wouldn't have been able to move, given the fact that I'm first generation Latina American, with lower working class parents. I would never have been able to go from East LA College to the Cal State system, which was my launching pad to the more prestigious universities here in the Northeast. So I say that because you might imagine that to hear the idea or the claim that massification means lower quality and lower standards is a little disturbing. So I wanted to ask you to explain a little bit more two things: why massification would mean lower standards rather than different standards, and if there are lower standards, why are those lower standards related to or rooted in massification rather than in financial pressures and revenue expectations that modern universities are experiencing?
Yeah, I don't know if I can adequately repeat the question. Maybe briefly, why does massification mean lower standards? My argument is simple, as I said. If you have institutions which don't receive sufficient funding to educate kids who are first-generation students who don't have the cultural capital, if you will, when they enter, you're going to have lower standards. Plus, these institutions, again, both because of lack of funding and your absolutely correct point, of lack of personnel who are trained to teach them. The kids are then being taught by not well enough trained professors. So standards deteriorate because of that. And to say that, well, the standards are different, I don't buy that. They're just worse.
Thank you. My name is Tom Wiley, and I'm a lecturer in the MED and doctoral program here in education. Wonderful to see you outside of on YouTube, I want to say that. A trends question. The European model, which many of us adopted from Bologna, do you see that model continuing with undergraduate education, with the Gen Ed core and specialization? And number two, follow-on question that we hear very little about is quality control, accreditation in the Bologna Agreement. As we develop more linkages overseas and this massification continues, could you comment on what you see as the future in terms of quality control?
Got another day. And it would be interesting to hear what our colleagues have to say about particularly quality assurance issues. What was the first part of the question?
On the European model.
Yeah, okay. American higher education comes from sort of three historical elements. One of them is the Oxford and Cambridge sort of collegiate tradition. One of them is the German Research University, and the other one is our kind of amalgamation of those two things, which produced kind of the service function for higher education. And that's what characterizes our system. Most European countries, and in fact most countries around the world, don't have general education. We have an expert on such matters here. She can give a lecture on that because she recently finished a dissertation on exactly that topic. And there's some interest, it's quite interesting, some interest in liberal general education in different countries, in part because of the complexity of the global knowledge economy and the idea that we discovered a long time ago that people change jobs and don't specialize as much as they used to. But having said that, most higher education, you're admitted to the faculty of engineering, you're admitted to the faculty of whatever it is, and that's what you study. And there's no possibility for changing. And there is some understanding that in the global knowledge economy, that's a bad thing. That's not so functional anymore. But it's very hard for academic institutions to change. And I would say that, again, is an American advantage. So the Europeans, in some ways, are becoming Americanized. And in fact, a lot of the Bologna initiatives, Hélène may have amusing things to say about this, the Europeans would never agree, but it's partly Americanization.
Absolutely.
That is, the Bologna concept of the bachelor's, master's, PhD, which all the European countries are sort of forced to adopt, in some cases with difficulty, and with lack of understanding. I mean, that's our system. And the idea is to have what they call the common European education space. Again, we could have a long discussion about that. Do you have any comment about?
I totally agree. I think that what Europe has tried to do is to have a compatible system in order to be able to exchange students and the workforce. And now, inevitably, I'll talk about Africa. Africa, in order to be able to continue to be compatible with our systems, is applying the same reform. And it is extremely, of course, extremely costly and in terms of resources and efforts. But it is spreading everywhere. I don't know about India and China. I'm sending the ball back to you.
Yeah. I would say not at this point.
No.
Except Hong Kong.
Except Hong Kong.
Except Hong Kong.
which is, we need to remember, part of China.
Yeah.
Is it?
I'd like to touch on the quality piece, I think, because I think the quality and assurance, I think, in higher education is never terribly transparent, even in the United States, even with accreditors. I worked in the Canadian system that doesn't have accreditation. It has a peer review process, both at the unit level and at the institutional level. And usually that's a provincial matter, not a federal matter. So you have individual provinces essentially setting the rules from a political public policy framework around what constitutes quality within higher ed, whether those benchmarks are in fact representative of quality or not is an open question. And I would argue that even the standardization of NEASC here, our accreditor in New England, even their standards it's up for question as to whether they actually inform quality or not. That having been said, I think anytime you put an institutional through some self-reflection, through the accreditation process, in particular this self-study that's required as part of the accreditation process, I think in my experience has been, and I'm rather cynical on accreditation in general, but the self-study actually informs, I think, an academic exercise that an educated faculty will start asking fundamental questions about curriculum, about outcomes, about whether they are in fact doing a good job, and in fact that does improve the process. So it's not the accreditation itself that improves the process, but rather the self-study, in my opinion, that forced exercise that we have to go through every 5 or 10 years, and so that on that level, I think benefits academic quality here in the U.S. That breaks down almost immediately when you start looking at transnational programs or delivering academic programs in foreign countries for a U.S. institution, because most countries tend not to have any kind of accreditation or standardization, especially in the developing world. And so this notion of academic quality becomes highly subjective, and that's kind of the open door, I think, that we've seen. The fastest growing segment right now for the Apollo Group is in Brazil. And a lot of the for-profits, Laurier, based out of Maryland, I think 78 of their campuses are or a third of their campuses in Latin America, are really driven in a for-profit model because of the type of standardization that exists here doesn't exist in many other countries. So the question of academic rigor really starts falling apart, I think, when you start thinking of a Western presentation in other countries. My hope is that what happened here in the United States around, especially here, Boston is kind of unique in the sense that there's so much competition, so many institutions, that I do think that it does elevate the quality of education generally. I think when I see colleagues, when I worked in Vancouver, there were 2 universities. We knew each other extremely well. There was a very collegial environment, and we did pretty much the same thing. There was not that pressure to really excel and to differentiate yourself, because you were going to get government funding, you were going to get students. It was fine. All you needed to be is cordial. Here in Boston, we need to be cordial, but at the same time, we're very keenly aware about our sister institutions in a very tight market. I think that element of competition, I think, can go a long way in particular markets where you introduce a different educational model and you challenge the status quo. And I think that if you can effectively do that, I do think that there's an opportunity here for the academic rigor and the academic quality to be elevated in some of these markets. But it's a really tough, and it's not going to be an accreditation system that's going to do it for it. The institutions themselves have to care about that academic quality, and so it's, I don't know if...
Do others want to weigh in on this?
I had just wanted to say, quality assurance is not my area of expertise, but two things that I thought were kind of interesting, just minor reflections. One is from a quantitative standpoint. I think it's interesting the amazing growth in agencies that are focused on quality assurance in higher education. I mean, it's certainly an agenda item across Europe and in different parts of the world that it was not in previous years, and I think there's something to be said for that. We have this discussion of tuning in Europe and in other places testing that out. The idea of learning outcomes, being more transparent and more on the table. Whether or not we all agree on those and how we're defining them and all those things is another matter. But I think the growth aspect of it is notable and says something important. And to that point, I have a doctoral student from Romania currently, and in class the other night she said, it's quite interesting. In the United States, I hear a lot of people coming out of higher education programs at the master's level in particular, going after jobs in student services. That's where the jobs are. In Europe, quality assurance. All the students that are interested in working in higher education are really looking more at quality assurance. So it does seem to be a growth area.
Yeah. And if I can make a couple very brief comments about this important issue. Laura, both of you are absolutely right. It's a serious growth area, and it's because of massification. It goes back to my theories in the first place. Everything does. But as you've got more institutions, more diverse institutions, societies, the government, people who are involved with accountability, and the public wants to know which ones are good and which ones are not, and which ones are so bad that they shouldn't be existing. Thus, you've got the rankings, which are at the top of the system, and then you've got quality assurance, which is every place in the system. So, yeah, it's necessary. Most countries do a very poor job. They're still trying to figure it out. And many of them make it too complicated. I like the U.S. system. I don't think the U.S. system would work most places. But for us, I think it's actually quite a good system for the reasons that Dean Labrie mentioned. I like to say that the American accreditation system basically measures lack of quality. That is, it provides a floor, and which is exactly right. That is, an institution which is below what the accreditor thinks is appropriate can't be accredited. But we don't pretend that we're going to give an A to Northeastern and a C to Berklee College of Music, because they're very different institutions with different goals and so on. So I think it's a pretty good system overall. It works for us, but it wouldn't work for a lot of countries. And it requires something that is in very short supply in much of the world: trust. Trust. If you don't have that, you're going to have a problem. And my final point on this is there are a lot of moves to make quality assurance international. To me, bad idea, because there's so many differences in the way systems are organized and their traditions and so on. I am even not a fan of, for example, ABED, or I forget the name of what the business schools.
AACSB.
Thank you. Yeah, because they're our values. Basically, this is American imperialism. I like to say, it's the neo-colonialism of the willing. That is, everybody wants it. It's not we're forcing them. We're not sending the Marines to get them to, conform to ABED. But it's still a mistake, because our tradition of engineering education or business education works fine for us, but it doesn't mean it's going to work fine in China or in Rwanda or wherever.
I would like to make sure that our virtual people
Yes.
have a chance to ask a question as well.
We have a few questions from them.
Okay.
So one question from,
Do you have the microphone?
thank you. This is a question from our online audience. So the question is, what does the panel think about the IB diploma program in Asia and Africa being used at high school level to prepare students to do global college level work?
And I'm talking to my.
Who might like to weigh in?
What was the beginning of the question?
What does the panel think about the IB diploma
The
program?
International Baccalaureate. So, I can, my only 2 cents about the IB program, I think is, again, I think it becomes kind of the haves and have-nots discussion. You just have to take a look around here in the United States. Affluent communities offer an IB program at their high schools. The poorer communities don't. That manifests itself throughout all of the countries that participate in the IB program. So I think it itself is, there's nothing inherently good or bad about it. It is what it is. I think the elite students at elite high schools are going to benefit, and they're going to excel faster because they're going to get those credits at universities. By the way, they don't have to pay university tuition, so they save even more. So the richer get richer in wealth transfers, if you really want to think of it from a social justice perspective. But that having been said, I'm not against them. I just say that they're not a panacea in the sense that the very poorest of communities, there are bright people in those schools, but they're not going to have access to an IB program, and that's not the solution for that particular community. We need to think more creatively around different opportunities there, even here in the U.S. in domestic policy. And because I've heard just in public debate in certain areas, whenever IB programs come in, I mean, high schools are competing with each other for prestige, and it's tied to real estate prices for homes, and it gets into crazy talk around educational policy sometimes. So, I think it's just a symptom of a lot of the other things that we've been talking about here.
I guess I would follow on and say that, an online program like edX has options that are free. So we worked with the White House on the Connect Ed initiative, and we did a whole series of AP prep courses that were prepared by colleges. And so rather than paying, for one of these courses online to do better at AP exams, we're offering those courses for free for students. And then also developing a series of teacher training courses. And offering teachers the options to bring in those courses into their AP prep courses as well. So it's an option where anybody can take it. You don't have to pay. You can use it to get yourself, on a better track. And we've had students who have taken these courses around the world, and it gets them on a track that evens them out with other people.
But if I could make a comment about both of these comments and the IB. I'm a huge fan of the IB. I think it's a wonderful curriculum, it's thoughtful, it's rigorous, and so on. But it's a European curriculum. It has the values of sort of the European elite ideas about education. That's great for Europe. It's okay for us. Is it relevant in other societies? I simply don't know. And one of the issues about edX courses in general, and I know what your answer is going to be, is that...
Wow, crystal ball.
Because I've heard Anand Agarwal answer the same question. Most edX courses are from U.S. Or European, but mainly U.S. kind of intellectual perspective. And again, that's fine, but how do we take into account the different educational ideas, philosophical ideas, and so on that come from other cultures?
So let's see if I do well. We do have a lot of U.S. Universities, but we also have universities from Hong Kong, from China, from India, from France, from Spain. So it isn't exclusively a U.S. perspective. And, to my point earlier on Xinhua, I think there's a huge advantage in having those different perspectives. And it's really up to the students to be able to choose. One of the things that we've seen, though, is to your point about English being the language. So we have courses in various languages. We have transcripts in various languages. But there's a huge interest in the English language courses, even if the course is offered in both languages. We recently did an MIT course in a multiplicity of languages, including Turkish. It was sponsored by Turkcell. And even we saw that people in countries where we were offering this course in their country's language actually picked English. So it was very interesting that there was this desire, same course, I mean, there's nothing different, but they wanted that English experience from the professor who spoke English. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting point. And back to one of the points I was making about how to cope with globalization. I asked my Russian colleagues, why are you in Tomsk, in Siberia, where I was not long ago, lots of snow,
Not more
almost
than
as
here.
much as we have. Why are you developing courses in English for Russians? Because other than some Chinese and Koreans, other international students are not going to Tomsk. And their answer is what you said. Russian students want to have courses in English because they want to improve their skills in English, because it's useful for them in the market, and it gives them better access to research and all the things we could sort of develop here. So and then how do you maintain a national identity in this sort of sea of English? Rhetorical question.
Well, and, my only comment about the English question, it seems to be kind of an American question. I don't hear very many of my European counterparts or even Asian counterparts even question the notion of English, yet we come to kind of ask that fundamental question, like, why wouldn't you teach in Russian, or why wouldn't you teach in Chinese? And they go, because we want to be heard by everybody. And for them, it's not an American thing. It's dissemination of what they find important, and they're using English as the tool to do that. And I do think that we tend to put our own cultural overlay on that question from an American perspective, probably because of our history around probably things that we shouldn't have been doing in our history. But it's a fascinating issue. It comes up all the time in the U.S. and I almost never hear about it in Europe.
But English is not considered a foreign language. It's a
Right.
it's a tool.
It's a tool, right?
It's a tool. Yeah. It's the way you choose to belong to the community of scholar and science. That's it.
We have time for one last quick question.
Hi, my name is Itza Moreno. I graduated from the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and now I'm working with the Cambridge Institute of International Education. And I would like to know your vision of the Latin community in the higher education in the next years. Thank you.
I didn't hear the last piece of it.
Did you hear the future of Latin American higher education in future years?
Yeah, okay, Latin American higher education.
Yes.
I have to say, if, you may have a thought about this too. I have to say, if Latin America continues to go in the direction it's now going in higher education, they don't have much of a future. They are less involved in general, globally, than most other parts of the world. They're still tied to what I think is a problematical model of the university in the public sector, these sort of very large, often free tuition public institutions that sort of work okay in the political context there, but don't make them competitive globally. So I say that knowing probably less about Latin America than the other regions, but that's my feeling. I'm not so optimistic. Now, there are some exceptions. The state of São Paulo in Brazil, which has 2 or 3 of the best Latin American universities, according to the rankings, spends a lot of money, has innovative ideas, has a very competitive research foundation, which spends a lot of money on basic research and applied research. There are a few of the Catholic universities in Latin America, which are, I think, quite competitive globally and have a vision. But overall, I see less to be excited about.
I absolutely agree. I think from what little I know about Latin America, nothing much is going to change in terms of its dynamism as a region and its position globally if there are not some very deep, very serious national questions and developments that allow these institutions that do seem to be very, very locked in an extremely traditional mode of thinking about higher education, how it's delivered, what you study, who goes, all those kinds of things. From the perspective of someone who, again, is highly focused on internationalization, it's the biggest puzzle in the world to have a major world region with one language and Portuguese, where so much collaboration and integration and mobility and dynamism could occur, and it's just not happening. And again, I think it goes back to those national experiences with higher education that are simply not, for whatever reason, ready to or able to commit and engage in deep ways. The one exception to that, or where I see a little chink of light, is in Colombia, actually. I feel like there's some very interesting conversations that are going on among a small subset of universities, and even at a national level, a dialogue about really wanting to jump into this internationalization discussion much more substantively, but I think it's only a first step. So it's a region to watch, but I think much needs to happen, again, deeply and internally before there are any changes.
And just one more comment. In 1918, there was the Great Reforma in Cordoba in Argentina, which spread throughout the continent. And they've never gotten over it. I mean, the Cordoba idea, many wonderful aspects of it actually, doesn't quite fit the 21st century global world. But many Latin American countries and the big research universities in those countries, the University of Buenos Aires, and one could go on, are kind of stuck in 1918 revolution.
Yeah. Any final comments from other panelists on this question?
I know, other than having adopted 2 children from Guatemala, my experience in Latin America and higher education is very thin, so.
Great. With that, I would like to turn it over for a couple of concluding remarks to Dr. Thompson-Jones.
Well, it falls my pleasant duty on behalf of Dean Labrie to give you all the warmest possible thanks for what you've done. And if I could riff a bit off of Dr. Rumbley's comment about how sometimes because of massification, various stakeholders don't always communicate with each other as they are isolated into different communities. What I think has been really great about this evening is that you came across the river and joined us. You took out your GPSs and found us all, and that you represented so many different stakeholders and express so many different aspects of something. Dr. Altbach, you certainly were able to define issues that I think will intrigue us and inspire us in our own coursework, and our students will be looking at in their research for a long time. So thank you so much. And we have small souvenirs, or large souvenirs, that you can carry back a little bit of Northeastern with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Rumbley, thank you
so
very
much.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Hélène Berneau, thank you very much. So, and Dean and Marissa, thank you too so much for your contributions.